To speak at the wake of the UK economy, I've invited along Michael Simmons, economics editor at The Spectator. Good morning to you, Michael.
Good morning.
Now, is there any... Let's see if we can start off with some good news. I always hope there might be something. Didn't the OBR sort of say, oh, actually, growth might have been a bit better than expected?
Yeah, so we've actually had some new figures on growth this morning from the Office for National Statistics, and they show that over 2024 as a whole, the economy grew slightly faster than the OBR said it did even just this week. But what's really interesting about the revisions that we've had from the ONS today is they've revised the 3 quarters leading up to July, and have basically said that growth kind of stopped at that point. Well, they say growth stopped. The growth before then was hardly growth at all, but things slowed down at that point. And what happened in July? Well, we had a change of government.
So it's basically what happened here, that sort of infinitesimally, almost imperceptible flickering changes in growth that is down to people just holding off and not making any decisions about what they're going to do because they don't know who's going to be in charge and what the policies are going to be.
Well, exactly, and the British economy has suffered from this since the COVID pandemic now, really, that we've got this sort of low consumer confidence and low business confidence. Although having said that, there was another slither of good news this morning in these retail figures that came out that said actually we're buying more from high street shops than we kind of had been expected to. So there's little glimmers of good news, but when we say there's good news, it's that something went up by 1% rather than being flat or falling. So, you know, it's good news in the context of British decline, but it's not really good news in economics more generally.
I mean, maybe we're buying more from high street shops. There's only about one of them left. Half the high streets in this country seem to be vape shops and Turkish barbers. So if you want to get anything, there's only one place you can pretty much go. I want to go back to worklessness here, because without a doubt, it's a huge drag weight on the UK economy when you've got a quarter of people saying they're disabled, 2 million more since the pandemic with mental health issues. They're not giving to the economy, they're taking off the economy. So some could be sympathetic in part to Labour's planned welfare cuts that's creating a massive backlash from backbenchers in that party. At large, do you support these cuts, or do you think, especially when it comes to things like carers allowances, that this is going to punish the most vulnerable?
Well, look, I think in general we need to reform the welfare system because, as you're pointing out in the introduction to this section, you know, with a quarter of people that say they're now disabled, 2 million more due to mental health, the economy is not going to grow if we have a welfare bill that's set to spiral to nearly £100 billion just for sickness. So I think, yes, reforms are needed, but I'm not sure this package has the right motivations behind it. I was really shocked, actually, when we got the OBR's report after the Chancellor sat down from delivering her spring statement, that she'd taken her headroom back to the exact figure it was at the last budget. And obviously a big part of the cuts was these welfare changes. Now, if you were doing reforms to the welfare spending that was genuinely motivated by getting Britons into work, by reducing the bill, there's no way that you would come back to that exact same figure. So it seems to me that rather than, you know, really thinking about these reforms, they've just moved things around on a spreadsheet to get back to a certain figure. And yes, as a result, you know, carers, etc., some people are going to be hit. So it seems like it's come from the wrong motivations.
Now, the problem, I think, and tell me if my reading is wrong, I think we're kind of in an economic doom spiral because part of the OBR sort of growth is said, oh, well, you know, immigration has helped so much of that. That's actually helped a GDP increase. We've had net migration figures of around 900,000 at this point. Now, when Germany did a little examination of the impact of immigration on the German economy, they've said that it's actually not a benefit at all. In fact, it's net negative. Where do you stand on this? Because I worry that, I mean, there's an article today in the Telegraph talking about Stockton-upon-Tees, which has got one of the highest levels of worklessness in the country. 67% of all working age adults are economically inactive. 43% have no qualifications. Only 11 people had worked in the previous 12 months. But the problem is, what you can see here is Stockton-upon-Tees used to have a huge amount of industry. It had shipbuilding, it had chemical plants, It had all sorts of places where people could go and earn their crust, which frankly don't exist anymore because we've clobbered manufacturing. And so people say, well, OK, you want to get us back into work, where are the jobs? And then other jobs are essentially being shipped out to immigrants because it's a cheaper labour force.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right. And actually, you see this in the growth figures today, that even though they said in the last quarter that the economy grew ever so slightly, when you looked at that on a per capita basis, it's actually shrunk. And part of that because of this immigration, the 900,000 figure that you say. But that was a deliberate economic choice that the previous government made because of this worklessness crisis, that they looked at the amount of vacancies we had in the economy, the amount of people going on sickness benefit, the amount of people in places like Stockton-on-Tees, as you point out, that are out of work. And whatever the last government and various different prime ministers, we've had a few, said about migration, they quite clearly made a choice that rather than solving this worklessness problem, we are going to just import labour en masse. And that's, how we've got to where we are today.
What is the solution, though? Because people talk about this all the time, net zero immigration policy, the idea that we need to get the British back into work, that we shouldn't rely on cheaper foreign labour. You get some people saying, well, actually, I do want to work, but because foreign labour is cheaper, I'm now priced out of the marketplace. You get other companies saying, well, because energy bills are so high, we can't afford these costs and that costs. Perhaps some of the rules are different if you're talking about things like national insurance payments, which again, the impact of that, employers' national insurance going up, has yet to hit the UK economy. So what is the solution here? I mean, when it comes to worklessness and people on benefits, is that where we should be getting really tough? Those people who, should be described as fit to work, who potentially aren't, do we need to sort of cut back on the people who are allowed to say that they need to claim benefits for health reasons? And when it comes to people who are job seeking, do we have to sort of get a bit tougher, saying, well, you might have to travel a bit further, you might have to do something that you might be overqualified for it, but tough luck?
Well, I think it requires, carrot and stick. We need to do all we can to stop people getting into this, what was the not fit for work category, which Liz Kendall says she's essentially getting rid of in her reforms. But there will still be this idea that once you're on some kind of sickness benefit, that's you out of the workforce forever. We need to reduce the number of people going into that category, because once you do, you sort of never come out of it. And then on the, so that's the stick. And on the carrot approach, we need to look at this mental health crisis, in that the 2 million people say they can't work because of mental illness since the pandemic is just a staggering figure. And something's changed within the psyche of, us as Britons, that's now seen as a medical problem. When you're dealing with stress and anxiety, the reaction now is to basically self-lockdown, to put yourself. And we need to get back to a place where people are encouraged to keep putting one foot in front of the other and to go to work and to get on with their lives. Now, I don't know how we do that, but until we fix that, this welfare bill and welfare caseload is going to keep shooting up.
Well, you might not know how one does that, Michael, but I'm pleased to say, stay where you are, Michael, but I'm going to invite Adam, a caller, onto the show now, because he's actually calling in. Because, Adam, as far as I understand, you've got ADHD, but it's not stopping you from working. Tell me about the sort of symptoms you suffer from, the work that you do, and whether or not work is a benefit.
Sure. Well, work is a benefit for a lot of reasons, but I grew. I'm 46, so I grew up in a system that didn't recognise ADHD or dyslexia back then, and I was labelled as disruptive and naughty and put into special school, as it's kids with behavioural disorders, with a bunch of other kids that are way worse than me, and everything, brought up, and just didn't understand who I was or what I was until much later on in my 20s, when my stepmother sent me to the Dyslexia Association to be assessed. And ever since then, that also having that helped me in job. It helped me get the apprentice that I got today, because it's the only time I ever claimed benefits was when I went on dole for nearly a year and a half. But I needed to do that to get into the system to be put forth for an apprentice, which is what I've worked with all my life. Now I have that skill. It's the job I've done.
Well, what is your job? Do you mind me asking, Adam?
Sorry?
What is your job, darling?
Oh, I'm in construction. I'm a builder. Right. I work in social housing mainly, fitting kitchens. Oh,
wow. OK. Can you explain to me, because ADHD, I hear a lot of people saying I've got ADHD. how does that manifest? How does that affect your daily life?
It's not a disability, let me tell you now.
Yeah, so tell me, just explain to me, so someone who, maybe I've got it and I don't know, but explain to me what the impact is.
It's like sometimes you've got to make concessions. It's like, if you hire someone in a wheelchair, you're put in a ramp, okay? So you hire me, all I ask is give me instructions verbally, visually, or given me in the written form, because it won't mean nothing to me and I won't understand. I won't be able to process that information. I process information more verbally. I'm audio-visual, so I don't learn from reading anything.
Yeah.
Because I'm concentrating so much. The ADHD is concentrating so much on the words, I forget all meaning to it. So it's something like that. You forget things. You can walk into a room and forget why you walked into a room. It's stupid, annoying little things like that with the ADHD. Whereas dyslexia is a gift. It makes me see the world in a very different way. You know, Albert Einstein was dyslexic. Jim Carrey is dyslexic and ADHD. You know, Richard Branson's dyslexic. It's just a different way of seeing the world, and you learn in different ways. And that's the problem with the schools of what I grew up in, because they're all laid out to learn the same way. Sit in front of a desk and read this. Right. So it doesn't work with me.
So interesting. I'm going to go back to Michael here, our economics editor at The Spectator. There's Andrew saying, look, you know, Adam, sorry, when it comes to schooling, it didn't cater for me, and therefore perhaps he was prejudiced against when it comes to systems we have of reading, revision, examinations, and then getting people into the apprenticeships. I was astonished when he said he had to go on the dole for 1.5 years to be able to access that scheme. But then he also said it's not a disability. You can work, you must work. I mean, is this where we need to completely revitalise our approach? And perhaps what we've got now is a sort of blanket policy where doctors are overstretched. People go to their GP and say, oh, I'm really not well, I'm tired, I'm run down, and they just go, right, we're signing you off. And then that just sort of becomes a repeat prescription, if you will, rather than people actually getting treated for things or getting to the root cause of issues.
Well, exactly. And it goes back to this point of attitudes. I mean, it sounds like the system essentially worked for Adam in that he went on to benefits so he could access that help, and because he clearly wanted to work. So we need to differentiate between people that want to work, but there's some sort of barrier that the state can help them with, and then people who don't want to work. And on your point of GPs, there was a survey recently that we covered in The Spectator. It's something like over 80% of GPs sign people off sick due to depression when essentially they don't believe there's anything medically actually wrong with them. So we need to look at things that are, you know, mental conditions, learning conditions, and say, do we really need to be medicalizing them? And if the answer is no, then these people should not be in this category where they can't work, and instead they should be given support to get into work that's adapted and suitable for them, like, you know, like in Adam's case.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Michael Simmons, economics editor at The Spectator.